The weight of remembering. The silence that followed Bumpy's last words did not feel empty. It felt crowded with thoughts no one in that room had planned to confront. The men were used to noise, to certainty reinforced by repetition, to an environment where questions were drowned out before they could fully form. Now those questions lingered, pressing against their chests, demanding space. Bumpy sensed the shift not through any visible sign of surrender or agreement, but through the way the room breathed differently, slower and more uneven, as though each person was suddenly aware of his own presence in a way he had long avoided. Bumpy did not mistake this for victory because he understood that reflection is often more uncomfortable than confrontation, and discomfort is where real change either begins or is fiercely resisted. One of the men near the back, older than most, finally spoke, in a voice that carried the weight of years rather than anger. He asked Bumpy why he cared enough to come here, why he would step into a place where he knew he would be unwelcome, risking humiliation or worse for people who had given him no reason to expect fairness. The question was not hostile. It was tired, almost curious, and that difference mattered. Bumpy answered by speaking about responsibility, about how his father had taught him that witnessing injustice without responding to it slowly reshapes a person into someone he no longer recognizes. He said he did not come out of hatred for anyone in the room, but out of a refusal to let fear decide where he could stand and where he could not. He explained that courage, as he understood it, was not about changing others by force, but about refusing to surrender one's humanity, even in places where it might be mocked or rejected. As Bumpy spoke, memories stirred among the listeners, uninvited and persistent. Some remembered fathers who had passed down bitterness like an heirloom. Others recalled moments when they themselves had been dismissed or underestimated, and how that pain had been redirected into anger rather than examined with honesty. The younger man, who had leaned forward earlier, now stared at his hands, his jaw tight, as though he were wrestling with thoughts he had long suppressed. Bumpy noticed and continued, speaking about how Joe Louis had carried not just his own ambitions, but the weight of an entire community that looked to him as proof that dignity could survive hostility. He described how Louis's discipline and restraint had inspired people far beyond the boxing ring, not because he preached, but because he lived his values under relentless scrutiny. That kind of example, Bumpy said, lingers in the world long after the noise fades. The leader of the group, feeling his authority slipping, attempted one last time to reassert dominance by questioning whether Bumpy believed stories and ideals could erase what he called reality. His tone was sharper now, edged with frustration rather than confidence. Bumpy met the challenge calmly, explaining that reality is not fixed, that it is shaped by choices repeated over time, and that every belief system begins as a story people decide to keep telling. He said that hate survives not because it is strong, but because it is familiar, and familiarity often feels safer than growth. Those words struck deeper than any accusation could have, because they reframed the group's certainty as comfort rather than truth, a notion that unsettled the foundation on which their identity rested. The room grew warmer as bodies shifted and tension accumulated, yet no one moved to leave or interrupt. The men were listening now, not because they had been persuaded, but because something in Bumpy's presence demanded acknowledgement. He spoke of moments in his own life when he had been tempted to respond to cruelty with cruelty, when anger seemed easier than patience, and how remembering his father's lessons and Joe Louis's example had helped him choose restraint instead. He admitted that restraint was not weakness, but discipline, and discipline, once learned, becomes a form of freedom. The honesty in his admission stripped away any remaining illusion that he believed himself superior. He was not standing above them, but beside a different version of the same human struggle. By now, the initial laughter felt distant, almost unreal, as though it belonged to another moment entirely. The men exchanged glances, some defensive, some uncertain, some thoughtful, and in those looks lay the unspoken acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. No one had shouted, no one had been threatened,
Yet the room had been fundamentally altered by the simple act of bearing witness to an alternative way of being. Bumpy remained steady, understanding that this was the most delicate phase of any confrontation rooted in belief, the moment when old certainties weaken but new understanding has not yet taken shape. As the clock on the wall ticked forward, Bumpy concluded by saying that he did not expect apologies or agreements, only honesty with oneself, because that is where all meaningful change begins. He reminded them that Joe Louis's legacy was not merely about victory, but about representation, about standing firm in one's humanity even when surrounded by hostility. When he finally fell silent, the weight of his words lingered, filling the room with a sense of unfinished reckoning. The men were no longer laughing, not because they had been defeated, but because remembering, questioning, and reflecting demanded more from them than mockery ever had, and that demand could not be ignored once it had been heard.
The room that laughed too soon. The bell above the door rang once, soft, almost apologetic. It was the kind of sound most men in the room didn't notice. They were too busy laughing, too wrapped up in their own certainty, their own noise, their own belief that the world inside those four walls belonged only to them. But that bell marked the moment everything began to change. Bumpy stepped inside alone. He didn't pause in the doorway. He didn't scan the room nervously. He didn't flinch. He simply entered, closed the door behind him, and stood there, calm, quiet, solid, like a man who had already fought his most important battles long before this one. The laughter started almost immediately. 15 men sat scattered around the room, some leaning back in wooden chairs, others standing near the walls. Their laughter wasn't joyful, it wasn't spontaneous, it was practiced, sharp, and meant to wound. The kind of laughter used when people want to feel bigger by making someone else feel small. "Look at this," one of them said, shaking his head. "Must be lost," another added. "Or brave," someone else muttered, followed by more laughter. Bumpy didn't respond. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered but not imposing in the way bullies often fear. His strength didn't announce itself, it settled. His coat was worn, his shoes clean but old. His hands, large, scarred, steady, hung loosely at his sides. Those hands had carried more history than any man in that room could imagine. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know just by looking, was that Bumpy had grown up listening to his father tell stories about Joe Louis, about a young man who had carried not just gloves into the ring, but the hopes of millions who were told they didn't belong. Joe Louis, who taught a generation that strength isn't about how hard you hit, it's about how steady you stand when they want you to fall. That lesson followed Bumpy everywhere, including into this room. The laughter continued, rising and falling like a bad song. Someone knocked over a chair on purpose. Someone else clapped slowly, mockingly. "You got a lot of nerve," one man said, standing up. "Walking in here like that." Bumpy met his eyes, not with anger, not with fear, but with something far more unsettling. Calm, understanding. "I'm here to talk," Bumpy said. His voice was deep, even, unshaken. It didn't challenge, it didn't beg, it stated. That only made them laugh harder. "Talk," another man said. "To who?" "To you," Bumpy replied. For a moment, just a moment, the room shifted. Not because they respected him, not because they feared him, but because something about his stillness disrupted their rhythm. They were used to reactions, anger, fear, defiance. They weren't used to composure. One of the men circled him slowly, like a dog unsure whether to bark or bite. "You know where you are, right?" "Yes," Bumpy said. "And you still came in alone?" "Yes." That word, alone, hung in the air.
What they didn't understand was that Bumpy had been alone before. Alone when his mother worked 3 jobs and still came home smiling. Alone when doors closed without explanation. Alone when he watched men with less skill and less heart get opportunities he never would. Alone builds something in you. It teaches you how to listen. It teaches you how to wait. It teaches you when not to speak. Bumpy slowly reached into his coat. The room stiffened instantly. Chairs scraped, muscles tensed. He pulled out, not a weapon, but a folded photograph. He placed it carefully on the nearest table. Joe Louis stood in that photograph, gloves raised, eyes focused, not in rage, but in purpose. "My father kept this," Bumpy said quietly. He said it reminded him that the world can be cruel, but it can be changed. More laughter. "Changed by what?" someone scoffed. "A picture?" "No," Bumpy said. "By people who refuse to become what they hate." That line landed differently. Some laughed louder to drown it out. Others shifted uncomfortably. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He didn't step forward. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there, letting the silence do what noise never could. "You think I walked in here by accident?" Bumpy continued. "You think I didn't know exactly who you were?" One man clenched his jaw. "You got 5 minutes before—" "I won't need 5, Bumpy said. The laughter slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. Bumpy straightened his shoulders, not in defiance, but in remembrance. He thought of Joe Louis standing in hostile arenas, thought of his father listening to crackling radio broadcasts, believing in something bigger than fear. "I came here because I believe something," Bumpy said. "I believe hate survives because too many people stay silent, and I believe courage doesn't always look like a raised fist." He looked around the room, meeting each gaze without flinching. "Sometimes," he said, "it looks like walking in alone." For the first time since the bell rang, no one laughed. They didn't know it yet, but 8 minutes hadn't even passed, and the room was already changing.